Normally, Calvin's up here talking about bridges, and I know you all have seen love, sure love as much as I do, waiting for the paper to come out so we can see what he's going to write about this week in the history, not just the beautiful photography, but the history of that. Calvin actually grew up in Kingsport, and his first job, of course, he's been replaced now by Dave Light, but it was at the WKPT radio and TV at the ripe old age of 15. After graduating from DB, and that's Dobbins Bennett for some of you there, Calvin went to UT where he worked for WBR TV and radio, and later at WIVK alongside broadcasting classmate Bob Kessling. Calvin also spent 3 years as a news reporter and photographer at WTVC Channel 9 in Chattanooga. In 1975, he joined WATE TV in Knoxville. Poor fellow can't keep a job, can he? And in 1979, he was promoted to the co-anchor of the 6 and 11 p.m. newscasts. That made Calvin the first African American to anchor a main newscast in East Tennessee history. He moved to Columbus, Ohio in 1985 as a consumer reporter, anchor, and talk show host, then spent a couple of years in Lancaster, Ohio as a news director of WSVZ Radio. 1992, Calvin moved back to Chattanooga to anchor News Channel 9's new Consumer Watch program. He anchored the 5, 6, and 11 p.m. news for many years until his retirement. He's kept busy filling in on the news desk at WRCB TV Channel 3 on a part-time basis. These days, I believe it's been a lifetime, he's a bridge photographer. The hobbies came, I believe, about 4 years ago, and had him come in and do all that. And one of the other neat things about Calvin, though, is that he really gets into his work and loves what he does and loves sharing the story about it. Today, he's here to tell us about the recent programs that they had and the efforts to bring the Rotherwood story to Kingsport. He's also covered for the television program, and special to me, he covered the Santa Train one year, and got ideas about getting back on there, so we're going to work on that. Calvin, it's all yours. Thank you for coming.
I appreciate it. Sit down, sit down, sit down. Sit down. Let everybody get comfortable here. How are you all today? Really? Are we that good or that bad? All righty. Well, let me get situated here. Thank you all for having me. Can everybody hear me all right? Can everybody see the pretty picture up there? All righty. Well, let's get started here. A couple of months ago, one of the most astounding reunions happened right here in Kingsport. It was a reunion that had never happened before in this area. Now, there may have been some get-togethers around Tennessee like it that I'd not heard about. This was a reunion of descendants of slaves from the Rotherwood plantation. And yes, I'm talking about that Rotherwood just over here across the river. Everybody in this room has a perception of what Rotherwood was like growing up. Oh, Rotherwood, the birthplace of modern-day Kingsport. Rotherwood. It's that big house over there at Forks of the River. Let's see, Rotherwood. It's that big mansion over there where John B. Dennis and J. Fred Johnson mapped out the future of this thing called the Model City. Rotherwood. Oh, it's that haunted house over there across the river where the ghosts haunt the grounds. Well, today we are going to add a new category to what you've heard about Rotherwood, slave plantation. Because believe it or not, that was part of its original purpose for being built. Now, I first started hearing about Rotherwood, about the slaves in Rotherwood in my own family. I mean, it's not exactly common knowledge that you learn in school or that you find in a history book. I learned about it word of mouth living right here in Riverview. And even then, it was something that most African Americans in Kingsport really didn't want to talk about. In fact, nobody wanted to talk about it. As historian for the Douglas High School Alumni Association, several years ago, the Kingsport Historical Society commissioned me to do a comprehensive history of African Americans in Kingsport to be included in the city's history books because there was no history of African Americans in Kingsport at all. Well, today, the history of African Americans in Kingsport is now part of Kingsport's official history, and part of that history is the other side of Rotherwood. Now, every family history has got to start somewhere. So, back to the Rotherwood slave descendants reunion we just had. My father's family is in that group. They were the Stafford family, direct descendants of the African Americans who lived right there on the plantation and who, as slaves, took the name Stafford after the Civil War. At the reunion back in September, everybody had a shirt just like this one. Had a shirt just like this one. And on the back was the name of the family. Now, now these right here are just some of the names that we documented. Some of the African American names we documented at Rotherwood: Leeper, Gillenwater, Gray, Watterson, Phipps, Pierce, Long, Lyons, Looney, Ewing, Manus, Garrett, Davis, Bryce, Horde, and many others. Some of those names were taken from the slave owner. Others came from people visiting the plantation. Still others were names the slaves might have heard that sounded good, and not having a surname back then, they took that name as a surname. Bill Carey at the website Tennessee History for Kids documented several plantations in East Tennessee prior to 1860. This is a partial list of them here. Camp Creek down here in Greene County, we're down around the Nolichucky. McBee's Ferry down here on the Holston River at the Jefferson-Knox County line. Mossy Creek, also in Jefferson County at Jefferson City. New Canton, right over here west of Churchill going up to the Tennessee-Virginia border. Powder Spring Gap over the Clinch Mountain in Granger County. Tampico, also in Granger County between Rutledge and Jefferson City. Also, Washington College in Washington County between Limestone and Telford. Now, all of that brings us to Rotherwood. At 2,500 to 3,000 acres, it was one of the largest plantations in all of East Tennessee. Now, African Americans have always been in Upper East Tennessee: Kingsport, Johnson City, Bristol, Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky. Fact is, it seems like we've always been here. This is a picture of the Pierce brothers back in the early 1900s hauling wood for a new business coming to Kingsport that used a dry distillation process to get chemicals from wood. The business was called, say it with me, Tennessee Eastman Company. Okay? Well, according to the research that I found, most of Kingsport's recorded African American history begins right here at the junction of the North Fork and the South Fork of the Holston River, right around the year 1820. Newspapers busily advertising slaves for sale. That's where we're going to right now. Okay, so picture this. We're back in the late 1700s, looking southwest from the Garden Mountain Tower on Bays Mountain over here, past what is now the Holston Army Ammunition Plant. As far as you can see, the Rotherwood Plantation. America was just about to become a country. A man by the name of David Ross came into possession of some property that started right here. Thousands of acres following the river down past what we know as Churchill, almost to Rogersville. I've documented the Ross property ending somewhere down near a place called Zion Hill. Now, the Zion Hill community is still there, and it is still farmland. In fact, many years into the 1900s, our own beloved Jill Ellis was born at Zion Hill in Hawkins County. Okay, here's the business part of the Rotherwood property. On the left is a hand-drawn survey of all the business locations on the Ross Plantation, and I'm going to walk up there so I can point some stuff out to you here. This is the hand-drawn survey of all the business locations on the Ross Plantation right here. On the right-hand side is a satellite picture of that same area today. The Cloud Plantation in the upper left-hand side of the green line here that you see up here, that line up there, you may have heard of Clouds Ford up here off Carter's Valley Road, right up here. The Roller Plantation was over here on the left-hand side. As you can see, Roller Farm. That's now what we call Ridgefields. Both the Cloud and the Pryor families had lucrative businesses building barges for the river. So when did slaves come into the picture? Well, nobody really knows for sure, but it had to be close to 1817, because that's when Frederick Ross inherited the land from his father David. Frederick Ross built a mansion that year, and he named it Rotherwood, after the mansion in Sir Walter Scott's novel, Ivanhoe. Ross also built an iron mill that you can see right here. No, the ironworks was up there. And this map is not to scale. He also had a wool and a silk mill. Now, the silk mill, that's what I was pointing at right there. And that was along the riverbank. Now, they were not very big, but they were very profitable. Okay, here is an ad. This is an ad right here for 4-4 cotton materials made by the Rotherwood Manufacturing Company at Kingsport. That's the wood and silk mill. The ad's aimed at wool buyers before they go north to buy the same product. Here's an article made right here at home, and in a few days, we will have an abundant supply of the above goods. In addition to working at the mills, slaves were also tending the Rotherwood fields of livestock, cornfields, tobacco, soybeans, and the fruit trees. Ross's business endeavors were very successful because basically the slaves were working pretty hard. The mills were producing, companies were buying the iron, everything was getting shipped out. The plantation farmland or farm life wasn't doing too bad either. Now, the earliest documentation I've seen and been told about shows that by 1830, African American slaves were working all over this plantation. Now, those slaves, they lived right here in a place that was nicknamed Rotherwood Heights. In this picture right here, Rotherwood Heights is the left-hand corner, that square right there. That was Rotherwood Heights, just up from Stone Drive. The Rotherwood Mansion spreads out, as you can see, down in the lower left-hand corner there with the arrows going out, headed toward Rogersville. Now, right now, we have no record of what the slave houses in Rotherwood Heights looked like, but I can only assume that they were ramshackle compared to the big house. Okay, so back to the business of Rotherwood. According to Jill Ellis, who grew up in the mansion much later as a child, Frederick Ross lost a lot of money through business deals. Folks, he was not the brightest bulb on the investment tree, okay? But he was kind to his slaves, and he freed many of them before the Civil War. There were probably more slave plantations before the Civil War between the Netherland end at Kingsport all the way down to Rogersville than any place else in East Tennessee. That quote comes from a gentleman by the name of Billy Lyons from right down here in New Canton. You'll remember the New Canton plantation was right next to the Rotherwood plantation. Mr. Lyons told me that his ancestors used to tell him what their ancestors told about life in servitude on the plantations in the eastern part of Hawkins County. What he told me had me running all the way down to the Hawkins County Courthouse and also going to Nashville at some point in the Tennessee State Archives. I found out that many of the plantations in this area had anywhere from 10 to 20 slaves. A few of them had as many as 300 slaves on each farm. Back then, slaves had to be upfront with their activities, but they were pretty secretive about their lives anyway when they were not working for the slave owners. Rotherwood's period of peace and tranquility between slave and slave owner lasted about 30 years. Because Ross mismanaged the farm's businesses, ultimately around 1850, he sold the Rotherwood plantation to his bookkeeper and overseer, Joshua Phipps. Among the descriptions that I read about Joshua Phipps said that, quote, hell was unleashed the day Phipps took control of the Rotherwood plantation. Jill Ellis said after she grew up, she heard about the mansion's history and wanted to learn a little bit more about it. She said her parents told her from their ancestors that Joshua Phipps was an absolute terror. Those were her words to me. She said that she was told that sometimes he beat the Rotherwood slaves so badly that some of them couldn't work the next day. She told me of one room in the mansion with stocks, like you see in this depiction here. The big blocks of wood, that you stick your head through the center and your arms stick out through either side. She said she was too scared to ask a lot of questions about it. In an interview with me, Mama Jill writes, I grew up on the 25 or so hundred acres of Rotherwood land. My mother, Inez Looney, was the cook, and my father, James Looney, was the chauffeur, the butler, and the mansion maitre d'. As a child, I had to go into the area where the old slave cells were almost every day because the food that Mother canned was stored in the basement, and the laundry facility was also in that area. The stench was embedded in the ground. The darkness and the dampness was sometimes overpowering, she said. One could only imagine hearing the moaning, the wailing, the crying of the slaves, their misery and despair. In the front room of the third floor facing the river was the whipping post. That would be that window that's just up above third floor on the upper right corner there. That room right there. The stocks that she was telling me about was in that room. She continued, slaves were shackled to the post to be whipped. The bloodstains are still embedded in the wood floors of that room. In days of low humidity, you wouldn't see them, but during days of heavy moisture, the wood would expand and the blood stains would show up again. Now, if you were a slave at Rotherwood during this time, don't ever run away. This is an advertisement in the Rogersville Times newspaper. It's dated June 12th, 1851, and it reads, $30 reward. Ran away from the newspaper subscriber living at Rotherwood, Hawkins County, Tennessee on the 15th. Whoops. Let me go back. A Negro boy named George. Said boy is about 24 years of age, 5 feet 6 or 7 inches high, heavy set, dark complected, high forehead, a good countenance, and weighs about 160 pounds. Had on when he left a pair of boots and a fine cloth frock coat. It is probable that he will attempt to get to a free state. I will give the above reward for his apprehension and delivery to me or confinement in jail so that I can get him. Or I will give $30 if taken out of the state. Signed, Joshua Phipps. Again, this was in the Rogersville paper, June of 1851. Okay, so how cruel was Joshua Phipps? Aunt Victoria was a black slave woman here at Rotherwood that took the Phipps surname when she was freed from slavery. She's an ancestor of the Price family that settled over here in New Canton and later Kingsport. In a Kingsport Times News article dated 1975 that I found, one of Aunt Vic's descendants told the story of her hiding out in the grass and the culverts whenever the slave traders came through so that she would not get caught and sold. Now, that descendant also said that Aunt Vic told her that both new Rotherwood owner Richard Netherland and Phipps routinely beat the slaves as punishment from time to time. Aunt Vic also told the story of how Phipps said he wanted to be buried. This is his gravestone, by the way. He wanted to be buried on the hill at Rotherwood in his grave, standing straight up, so that he could look out in the bottoms and see the slaves working. As mean as Joshua Phipps was, fate had a way of dealing its own cruel hand. In July of 1861, Phipps got real sick. According to the legend, as he laid there in the bed, a swarm of flies filled his mouth and his nostrils, and eventually he smothered to death. Now, that same legend says that a big crowd gathered for the funeral, and the horses pulling his casket up the hill to the cemetery started bogging down. They got more horses, and as the casket finally moved up the hill, a big black dog jumped out of the box and ran down the hill. Suddenly, the skies opened up. Rain came out like water out of a bucket. They got the casket in the ground, and everybody ran off. They called the big black dog the Hound of Hell. And the legend says he roams the area around the Rotherwood mansion along with two ghosts that haunt the mansion. One of them, Joshua Phipps himself. The other is the ghost of his mistress, who was killed by the slaves who rose up against her. Do I believe any of that? No. No. I don't. Not a word of it. But I have been to his gravesite. If he is buried standing up right here, nobody knows because we can't see underground. But take a look at the background behind his gravesite on the hill. His gravestone does overlook what used to be the plantation. Okay, so into the 21st century we are, and Rotherwood Heights is still over there on the north side of Stone Drive. It became a prosperous neighborhood. Stores, churches, a meeting hall. Looking south there, that's Stone Drive up there on the right, on the upper right. That's Bays Mountain back there in the background. As I mentioned, my father's ancestors, the Stafford family, had a home there. The land divided up into lots so that everybody could have an equal share of the former plantation. If you drive up there today, you'll find at least 3 streets named after African American families from the plantation who lived there. Watterson Street, Gray Avenue, Stafford Street. One part of the former slave family that took the name Ross settled right down here in Rogersville. And yes, indeed, the story is true. They are the ancestors of Diana Ross, the singer, actress, and lead singer of the Supremes. All of her ancestors are from Hawkins County, Tennessee. Now, of course, we know that later on, financier and banker John B. Dennis moved into the Rotherwood mansion here. If the walls could talk, they'd probably tell you the stories of how John B. Dennis and J. Fred Johnson made the deals that brought the railroad to Kingsport, Tennessee Eastman Kodak, Borden Mills, the press, Meade, the brickyard. If the ghosts could talk in that house, the only thing haunted would be their imaginations. So, I've lost my other page. But, oh. Thanks for catching that. Because this is the best part. We don't know what happened before slavery, but from Rotherwood Heights to Old Kingsport to Sullivan, to the Sullivan, Dale, Maple, East Sevier Avenue area, and eventually to Riverview. African Americans in Kingsport have had a long history that is just now getting documented. And that is another speech that I do at another time. Thank you all for having me today. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them